In the middle of the 14th century, people went to bed healthy and woke up dying. Fever arrived without warning. Painful swellings appeared beneath the arms and along the neck. Within days, sometimes hours, entire households vanished. Church bells rang so frequently that cities stopped counting the dead. Graveyards overflowed. Markets fell silent. Across Europe, the same question was whispered in every language. Was this the end of the world? What people did not yet understand was that they were living through the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history, a disease that would kill as much as half of Europe's population and permanently reshape society, economy, and belief. This was the Black Death, and once it began, there was no immediate escape. To understand the scale of what followed, we must first look at the world the plague entered. Long before the plague reached Europe, it existed far beyond its borders. The disease was not new. It circulated for centuries in parts of Central Asia, where rodent populations carried it endemically. In these regions, humans, animals, and fleas lived in close proximity, allowing the illness to persist without causing continent-wide collapse. What changed in the 14th century was not the disease itself, but the world around it. By this time, Eurasia was more connected than ever before. Overland trade routes linked China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in a continuous commercial system often described as the Silk Road. Caravans transported silk, spices, precious metals, and grain across thousands of kilometers. Along with goods moved animals, people, and parasites. This integration was reinforced by political stability across much of the continent. Under the rule of the Mongol Empire, vast territories were secured, roads protected, and long-distance movement encouraged. Merchants could travel farther and faster than in any earlier period. Disease traveled with them. The plague moved gradually westward, following the same commercial corridors that sustained prosperity. From Central Asia, it reached regions around the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus. From there, it advanced toward the Black Sea, a critical junction between overland and maritime trade. At each stage, the disease encountered familiar conditions: dense settlements, close contact between humans and animals, no understanding that illness could be carried invisibly from one place to another. There was no alarm. To medieval observers, outbreaks appeared local and isolated. No one yet recognized that these distant events were connected, or that they formed part of a single, expanding crisis. The Black Sea region sat at the edge of Europe's economic world. Its ports linked caravan routes from the east, with ships bound for the Mediterranean. Grain, furs, slaves, and luxury goods passed through these cities constantly. So did the plague. By the mid-1340s, the disease had reached this crossroads. It had not yet entered Europe itself, but it stood at the threshold. The conditions that sustained medieval trade had now aligned with the conditions that sustained disease. The final transition from land to sea was about to begin. By the mid-14th century, Europe's prosperity depended on movement. Food, raw materials, and luxury goods flowed continuously through maritime and overland networks. Ships crossed enclosed seas. Barges moved along rivers. Merchants traveled predictable routes between fairs and ports. These systems were efficient, reliable, and indispensable. They were also vulnerable. Ports concentrated people, animals, and cargo in confined spaces. Crews lived aboard ships for weeks. Rats thrived in holds filled with grain. Fleas moved freely between animals and humans. No one understood that disease could travel this way. Commerce continued uninterrupted, not because people felt safe, but because stopping meant starvation. The decisive transition occurred where land routes met the sea, along the northern shores of the Black Sea. In 1346, the port city of Kaffa stood at the center of this world. Controlled by Genoese merchants, it linked caravan routes from Central Asia with maritime trade bound for the Mediterranean. It was fortified, wealthy, and densely populated. That year, Kaffa was placed under siege by forces of the Golden Horde. The siege dragged on for months. Military conditions were harsh, camps were crowded, sanitation was minimal. Disease spread rapidly through the besieging army. Soldiers fell ill in large numbers. Mortality increased. The siege weakened, not through defeat in battle, but through biological collapse. As conditions deteriorated, Genoese ships began to leave the city. They carried refugees, crews, and cargo. They also carried rats and fleas that had moved unnoticed between land and ship. This marked a critical shift. The plague was no longer confined to overland routes. It had entered the maritime system that connected Europe's major cities. As the plague spread, Europeans struggled to explain what they were seeing. No one understood bacteria or contagion. Illness was interpreted through inherited systems of thought that had shaped medicine for centuries. Physicians relied on classical authorities and on the theory of humours, which held that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids. Disease was believed to arise when that balance was disturbed by environment, diet, or seasonal change. One of the most common explanations was corrupted air. Many believed the plague was caused by poisonous vapors rising from the earth or drifting from distant regions. Earthquakes, rotting matter, and unusual weather were thought to pollute the atmosphere. Cities attempted to counter this threat by burning herbs, lighting fires, and carrying scented materials through the streets. Astrology offered another explanation. Medical treatises linked the outbreak to rare planetary alignments, arguing that celestial forces had altered the air and weakened the human body. These interpretations were widely accepted among educated elites and informed both diagnosis and treatment. Medical responses followed these assumptions. Bloodletting was used to restore balance. Purging and controlled diets were prescribed. Patients were advised to avoid cold air or excessive heat, depending on symptoms. None of these measures slowed the disease. Alongside medicine stood religion. For many, the plague was understood as divine punishment. Sudden mass death appeared to confirm long-standing beliefs about judgment and sin. Public prayers increased. Cities organized processions and days of fasting. Churches filled as people sought protection through repentance. In some regions, groups known as flagellants emerged. They traveled from town to town, performing public acts of penance, believing that suffering could avert further catastrophe. Authorities often viewed these movements with suspicion, but their popularity reflected the desperation of the moment. Clergy played a central role in caring for the sick and administering last rites. This placed them in constant contact with the dying. Mortality among priests and monks rose sharply, further weakening local institutions. Because medieval society did not recognize person-to-person transmission, none of these responses reduced exposure. Many practices, processions, communal prayer, medical visits, brought people closer together at the very moment distance would have mattered. Medical and religious explanations did not replace one another. They existed simultaneously, offering meaning where certainty was absent. Together, They shaped how communities responded, even as death continued to spread unchecked. The search for causes brought comfort, order, and authority. It did not bring control. By the time these explanations took hold, the plague had already moved beyond theory. Its effects were now transforming daily life inside Europe's cities. As mortality increased, the plague began to overwhelm the basic functions of urban life. Cities depended on constant coordination. Food had to be brought in daily. Markets required labor, transport, and regulation. Courts, workshops, and guilds relied on predictable attendance. As illness spread, these systems did not fail one by one. They weakened together. Workers fell sick or fled. Merchants abandoned stores. Officials stopped reporting for duty. Food distribution became erratic. Prices rose. Supplies spoiled before reaching markets. The poor were hit first, but no group was untouched. Burial practices collapsed under the scale of death. Churchyards filled quickly. Families were no longer able to perform traditional rites. In many cities, the dead were collected and buried in large pits. The presence of unburied bodies further strained sanitation that had already been inadequate. Municipal governments attempted to respond, but their capacity was limited. Councils issued ordinances to restrict movement or gatherings, yet enforcement was inconsistent. Many officials fled to the countryside. Those who remained lacked authority or manpower. Urban life, built on density and interaction, became a liability. What was collapsing was not simply public health, but the urban model itself. By the time the plague began to recede, Europe had been fundamentally altered. Between 1347 and 1351, an estimated 30 to 50% of the population died. In some regions, losses were even higher. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields returned to grass. Houses stood empty for years. This was not simply a demographic shock. It was an economic rupture. Medieval society depended on human labor at every level. Agriculture required hands to plant and harvest. Crafts depended on skilled apprentices and journeymen. Transport relied on muscle and animal power. When people disappeared, production collapsed. Survivors found themselves in a new position. Labor became scarce. Employers competed for workers. Wages began to rise, sometimes sharply. Peasants left estates that had once bound them by obligation. Artisans demanded better terms. Mobility increased as people moved in search of opportunity. Land, once the most valuable resource, lost some of its power. There was more of it than there were people to work it. Authorities attempted to restore the old order. In many regions, laws were issued to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict movement. These measures aimed to preserve traditional hierarchies and stabilize prices. In practice, enforcement proved difficult. Local officials were weakened. Records were incomplete. Communities lacked the manpower to police themselves. The balance of power had shifted. Feudal obligations, long enforced through custom and necessity, began to erode. In some areas, rents were renegotiated. Labor services were commuted to cash payments. Contracts replaced tradition. These changes were uneven. Not every worker benefited. Not every region transformed at the same pace. Yet across Europe, the assumption of an abundant, replaceable workforce no longer held. Because medieval economies were built around fixed obligations rather than flexible markets, sudden population loss created pressure for adaptation. Where labor was scarce, bargaining increased. Where authority weakened, change followed. Social tension grew alongside opportunity. Elites resented rising wages. Landowners complained of idleness and disorder. workers pushed for autonomy. Conflicts erupted in towns and countryside alike, reflecting uncertainty rather than collapse. The plague had not created these pressures from nothing. Population growth before the outbreak had already strained resources. The disease simply removed the people, leaving systems exposed. What emerged was a Europe forced to renegotiate the relationship between land, labor, and power. The consequences of that renegotiation would define the late medieval world. When the waves of plague finally subsided, Europe did not return to what it had been. The loss of population left lasting marks on the landscape. Fields were abandoned. Forests reclaimed farmland. Settlements shrank or vanished altogether. In surviving towns, empty houses stood as reminders of absence. Yet from this contraction came transformation. With fewer people and more land, resources were redistributed. Wages stabilized at higher levels. Labor relationships shifted from obligation toward negotiation. Feudal structures weakened, not through revolution, but through attrition. The Black Death did not create a modern world. It accelerated an existing shift. At the beginning, people went to bed healthy and woke up dying. At the end, those who survived woke to a quieter world, a world with fewer voices in the street, fewer hands in the fields, more space, more uncertainty, and new possibilities. Understanding how the past worked helps us see the world we inherited. I'll see you in the next chapter.